Project Binky in colour. Starring Nick Blackhurst. Also starring Richard Brunning. And Rex Hamilton as Abraham Lincoln.
Tonight's episode, Clutching at Straws. Coming up in episode 37, I finally get time to take a break. Nick blows a seal. And Binky coerces a miner into escaping the shed, and strange things occur while it's in the wild. At the end of the previous episode, we'd fitted most of the rest of the running gear, and despite the compromises needed because of the space constraints, along with my wiring, nothing being where it was ever designed to be, all the best guesses, and then drawing on the experiences of past failures, it actually ran, which was nice.
So the next step is to continue with the build up to the point where we can get the engine running for longer and get it up to temperature for the first time. Or at least that was the plan, but Dean from Trimworks is on his way over with his pot.
You might be familiar with his work if you've watched our friends over at Retro Power. And if you haven't, you should. They do terrific work. Dean came along to drop off the interior, and while he was here, we roped him into helping us fit the headlining he made. But before that goes in, we've got to stick the sound deadening to the roof. Some of you thought we'd forgotten it when we did the rest of the Dynamat, but using the heavy bitumen product on the inside of a black roof, we thought might be a recipe for sagging. And neither of us want any more of that in our life than we already have. So, we consulted the experts at Dynamat, and they prescribed this half-inch thick Dynaliner. It's much lighter than the other stuff, so is less likely to come away from the roof if the sun comes out.
Forgotten about the roof.
If you've ever attempted to fit a headlining, especially one to a Mini, then you'll know it's a hateful job. And when you've got a bespoke one, made from an expensive material that Nick specified, it's even worse. So that's why we bribed someone else to do it with the promise of tea and biscuits. Once the rods are all in place, and that's the easy bit, the headlining needs to be stretched, taut and clipped to the aperture seams. It's all too easy to rip the material, which would be a disaster. So, as Dean made it, he gets to pull, stretch and generally finagle the headlining until all the ripples have gone and it's smooth and wrinkle free. This is not an easy or quick thing to achieve. When Dean is happy with the fit, the pot comes out and headlining is very carefully glued to the shell. It's a painstaking process, and you're only ever one small slip away from having to make another one, so distractions were kept to a minimum to let Dean concentrate. Yeah, in other words, we just sat there watching him while drinking endless cups of tea. Looks like I picked the wrong week to quit sniffing glue. But anyway, Dean put the pot away and declared it was time to get steamed. This is basically a kettle on wheels with a long flexible hose to which various attachments can be added. The idea is that the steam heats the material uniformly. It adds some moisture in the process, and then as the headlining cools, it shrinks a little bit, thereby pulling it tighter. Providing it was installed well before this step, it makes for a really good finish with absolutely no wrinkles. This job was completed over 2 days, but it was time well spent because the result is fantastic.
It may look like Alcantara and feel like Alcantara, but what it actually is mini freshwater otter skins on a carbotanium substrate. Or at least it sodding well should be, given how much it costs.
Don't worry, we're only joking. No otters were harmed in the making of the headlining, as we only had enough for the seats. So after that incredibly tactile interlude, we're back to the headline act.
Oh.
No, there's not much room left, but I've already fitted the most important parts in order to get the engine to fire. So, to achieve our next goal, it should be fairly plain sailing because Nick's fitted the radiators loads of times and there can't be that many other bits left. How do you mean wiper linkage? In what's fast becoming a trope, there's a strict order to assembly with this car, and I'm reliably informed by his nibs here that the wiper linkage must go in next. Before we go any further, common sense dictates that it's a lot easier to bleed the clutch up before the radiators go on, especially as Nick's buggered off and I've got to do it on my own. The fluid feed from the reservoir to the brake master cylinders is on the bottom, but the feed to the clutch master cylinder is halfway up the reservoir. This means that if you lose hydraulic fluid from the clutch line, no matter how bad, you don't lose the brakes.
Try it.
To stop any vacuum leaks while we're running it, it would be silly not to connect the boost control solenoid and the map sensors. It's all colour coded to make fault finding much easier. The next big ticket item is the charge cooler, which gets bolted down to its brackets. One of the challenges with this car is going to be cooling it. So, to help keep underbody temperatures to a minimum, we've treated the downpipe to some lava exhaust wrap. It's made from volcanoes, and they're very hot indeed. So, along with a ceramic coating, this should help keep the heat from the exhaust gases inside the downpipe. Must not forget to plug the wideband lambda sensor in. The turbine housing gets incredibly hot, so to complement the ceramic coating, we're adding this turbo shield in an effort to keep the heat in the hot bits. After securing it to the housing with a stainless steel tie, the rest of the exhaust gets bolted on. That pile of components on the floor from earlier is diminishing with every minute that passes as we keep adding stuff to the car. We've slipped on the accessory drive belt here and tensioned it accordingly. We found a reconditioned power steering pump on a well-known auction website, so that gets fitted in place of the scabby old one from the breaker's yard. So this is the current sitrep, and it's about to get even more full as it's nearly time for the radiators. But first it would be easy to forget the bonnet release mechanism before the front crossmember goes on. And then the radiator. She's snug. There's a bug. The bottom hose and the top hose are connected before the clamps are tightened up. These are brand new Jubilee clips. I know, no expense spared. The rest of the cooling pack is added to the front end and the brackets are tightened up. And finally, we add some water to the radiator for the very first time. This is exciting stuff because now we can get it running again, and this time for more than just a few seconds. This is genuinely the first time we've run the engine with its full custom-made stainless steel exhaust on. And right now, it's only got a very basic start tune, so this is not one you've heard. So if it sounds familiar, it's not. Time to run it through the gears before switching it off. So we've sorted the go, now we've got to think about the woe. And as we've created what's probably the world's heaviest Mini, we're going to have to go full retard.
Never go full retard.
Now you might think it's as easy as throwing the biggest brakes we can find at it. We've taken some stick recently over our use of comparators. So to make the size of this brake disc totally obvious, here's a drill bit for scale. But as it turns out, there's a lot more science to it than that.
Historically, a car's brakes were sized depending on its weight and performance. Nowadays, nearly all manufacturers over-assist and oversize their brakes and then rely on a decent ABS system to stop it snatching or locking. Which is fine, if you've got one. And if the one you've got's working.
Yes. When it suddenly doesn't work, you end up laying a trail of parallel black lines, crash through some cones and wreck a pair of tyres, if you're lucky.
A lack of ABS is definitely one of the reasons, but isn't the main reason for not using a disc like this. Thank you, Brigitte.
This OEM Jaguar disc is 2 inches bigger than the biggest wheel ever fitted to a production Mini.
You may think it's just about discs and calipers, but their interaction with both the wheel rims and the suspension means that when choosing brakes, you've got to consider all of those things as an assembly right from the start. So seeing as our biggest limitation is getting brakes under mini-sized wheels, it seems sensible to start trying to stop by looking at mini brakes. Oh dear. While the Cooper and Cooper S's came equipped with similarly sized front discs, most early Minis, including this one, came with these 7-inch drums all round. They are mostly maligned, but regularly serviced and properly set up, they're utter shite. Actually, that's a little unfair. They were perfectly adequate for pottering around town with less than 40 horse in early 60s traffic. It's just that these didn't actually get upgraded until the mid-80s. That's when Minis changed from a 10 to a 12-inch wheel and a much bigger disc brake, similar to the newer but very closely related Metro.
When he says much bigger, he means slightly bigger, like an inch bigger. It's a 213mm diameter. But at least they were gripped by a nice 2-pot AP caliper.
Yeah, the mini calipers never really changed a lot over 40 years, but the Metros, well, weirdly, they all got a 4-pot caliper as standard, and the quicker ones even got a vented disc. So the mini braking hotness back in the day was to find a broken MG Metro, there were many, relieve it of its complete front uprights, and there you go, a cheap, bolt-on-ish, 4-pot vented disc brake conversion.
So why the history lesson? Well, all those parts are still available new, and with a big aftermarket scene you can even get upgrades like billet alley calipers, and all of these are designed to fit underneath well-proven and fairly inexpensive 13-inch rims.
Which makes it all the more unfortunate that none of those bits want to play nicely with our not mini hub and drive flange. Not to worry, in the UK, careering around the countryside in compact classics with tiny tyres is quite a popular pastime, so we're not the first to come across our current conundrum. Consequently, several shiny solutions are already available. While it's about the same size, a billet caliper like this is radial mount rather than the lug, which means it's much easier to put it exactly where we want it. The only issue with these is they run quite a small pad, so I'd want to use quite a bit bigger disc, and I'm not sure we can fit one. And to answer the obvious question of why don't we just bolt the Celica brakes back on it, well, we tried that first. They don't fit under the wheels, and honestly, they weren't very good.
The later ST205 Celica had much better brakes, 4-pot fronts as standard, and a nice sized disc to match. Unfortunately, you needed 17-inch rims to accommodate them.
There's a perfect solution for our needs out there somewhere. To find it, we just need to do a bit more research and a lot more mocking about.
I've no doubt that cardboard ceramic brake systems are indeed the future, but we're not quite there yet. In the meantime, we're using the cardboard to aid our design. That might catch on. You could call it CAD for short. Anyway, Nick's ruined a Peugeot brake disc to act as a bell for our lovely corrugated fiberboard rotor, and a bit of old aluminium angle from a shelf is shaped to use as the caliper bracket.
Here's where we're up to. I can't set the disc back any further because it wants to interfere with the hub. Now that could be strategically shaved, but we wouldn't lose much before we have the same problem with the bottom ball joint, which we can't do much about. Not a massive problem in itself, but the disc dictates where the caliper sits. And that just happens to be right in line with this strengthening rib stroke tyre well is in the rim. Which means that while the 13-inch rim part of the wheel isn't a problem, even with a tiny disc, we still can't clear a small caliper. Bugger. Well, they would have worked and they were a nice idea. These wheels are NFG.
We scoured the internet for wheels that would suit, but nothing came of it. And then a chance conversation with a friend of ours led us to a bloke called Carl at Force Racing. He didn't have anything suitable either, but he did have various machines and a will to use them, so that led us to break out the pencils and draw what we needed. A few weeks and some pounds later, we ended up with these. Strictly speaking, this 3-piece wheel is put together wrong, with the centre on the outside. But that meant maximum width on the inside and minimum width on the outside, as we didn't want to make the car any wider than it already is. There's a great big boss for the offset, but more importantly, it's a straight line from the mounting face to the edge, giving us a whole bunch of room inside the wheel, which allowed us to make some decisions. Decisions like this 280mm rotor, like this custom-made aluminium bell that Carl whipped up while he machined the wheels, and like these AP Racing CP4567 4-pot calipers. Yeah, I'm aroused too.
That bit of old shelf ain't going to cut it.
Nope, we need a proper bracket that befits the radial mount APs. So, while Nick gets on with that, I'm going to get the funk out. After a coating of black epoxy, the brackets look great and this little lot is ready to go on the car. But only after assembling the bell and the rotor. Bell. Having no ABS and no servo assistance, combined with a competition pedal box and racing calipers, you might think is a recipe for disaster on the road. And you might be right. But if you've ever driven a car with this type of setup, you'll know that it gives unrivaled feel. You might have to push the pedal a bit harder than normal, but the feedback you get through the ball of your foot is second to none. That is until you panic, lock the wheels up and send it through a hedge backwards. On fire. With the brake lines attached, there's only one thing left to do on the front brake setup, and that's to fit the pads. Being a competition caliper, it's designed to make changing pads as easy as possible, and it doesn't get any simpler than slide them in and do one bolt up. Even I can manage that. With supervision. That looks pretty cool, I have to say. Anyway, will our expensive new 13-inch wheels fit over those 11-inch discs and 4-pot calipers? Bloody hope so. Yeah, of course they do. A hell of a lot of time and effort went into making sure they did. But there's always that niggling doubt until it all goes together for the first time. Peeking out through the slots, the yellow writing gives just a hint of what hides behind the titanium-hued 3-piece rims. I suppose we'd better check it's not binding. Excellent. Now, how tight is it in there? Very tight. Very tight indeed. Tighter, in fact, than the hinges on Nick's wallet. To give you a better idea, we stuck some milliput to the tightest points and then whacked the wheel on. The squished putty gives you an idea of how little room there is between the caliper and the rim. That's 2 Stanley blades for scale. We calculated we'd have about 1.5 mm clearance, and that's precisely what we've got. I just hope the wheels don't need balancing. The consequence of having a very straight-barreled 13-inch rim specially made is that we realised we could use the stock Celica brake setup on the rear. It was old and manky, so we set about reconditioning the major components and buying new bits only when necessary. Overhaul kits for the calipers and the handbrake mechanism are readily available, as are shoes, discs and pads. It's amazing what a quick turn in the blast cabinet and a coat of silver VHT will do. Once we've checked that the rear wheel fits nicely and doesn't bind anywhere, I think we can call the brakes sorted.
We'll take the rears as a win, but being forced into having these spectacular lightweight billet racing split rims custom made just so we could fit bigger high-end discs and calipers is not quite the inexpensive bolt-on solution I was after. But I guess them's the brakes. Don't be like that. You knew that was coming at some point. Deep down, you knew. And anywho, we're not quite done here yet. There's yet another piece of this setup puzzle to check, you know, because Binky.
Yes, we need to ascertain whether the expertly 3D printed, thanks Ivan, and beautifully painted, thanks Tony, arches cover the new wheels.
No, hang on, wait. There is a third thing.
Of course there is.
With all this talk about brakes, it's probably worth mentioning that... Hang on. It's a little different on a permanent 4x4 like this, but for most cars, dynamically, 3/4 to all of your retardation is managed by your front axle. So you can fit the biggest, most expensive brakes you can find. The limit of their performance is grip, because they only ever get to work through 2 small contact patches. Which means that a lot of times, the best performing, most cost-effective brake upgrade is tyres. Anyway, get on with the story.
Yes, thanks. Anyway, despite always being thought of as a buck for a mould, we were so happy with the arches that we decided to throw caution to the wind and just try them on the car as they are. A chance meeting with Tom at Darwin Composites, who's an expert in composites, led us to hand them over to him for some reinforcement. He's lined them with Dylan and carbon fibre to make for a very impact resistant inside. The mounting bosses and edges have also been strengthened, so hopefully they'll last at least until it gets crashed. The arches don't mate directly with the wings, there's a rubber interface betwixt the two. It's a self-adhesive gasket type thing that stops the rattling and the vibration from rubbing all the paint off. It's also a pain in the arse to fit perfectly. On the back, the arches bolt through from inside the boot and inside the cabin. Whereas on the front, the bolt holes are all in the wing, which on our Mini is on the flip front frame. Once Nick's bolted these on, we'll be able to see how far the tyre stick out is. My bet is somewhere between cheeky and taking the piss. What do you think? Cool. I'll take that, I reckon. Nice. The car is still on the axle stands and the suspension is in full droop, so with a bit of static negative camber to come when it's on the deck, I'm calling that a win. Excellent. Now if you're thinking those wheels look familiar, then you're right, because they're modelled on the 1100 special wheels the car came in on way back when. Many moons ago, we were invited to bring the Mini along to the inaugural historic rally festival being held just down the road near Telford. We jumped at the chance, obviously, knowing full well we'd have plenty of time to finish the car. Global events led to the show being postponed twice, leaving us even more time to get it completely finished. So here we are, a day before the event, throwing parts we've had kicking around the workshop at it, in a mad dash to get it to Weston Park, looking like we've just thrown a load of parts at it. We were honoured to be asked to be the spectator safety car at the historic rally festival back in August. The event brought together dozens of rally cars from all over the country on the famous Weston Park stages. Our experience of the event is coming up in a subsequent video. Unfortunately, what you won't see is Binky out on those stages. A couple of days before the event, we were fully prepared to engage smug mode because, in what felt like the first time in ages, we'd actually made some progress. That is until this happened. A catastrophic failure of the alternator drive brought us crashing down to earth. And that wasn't even the most immediate issue. Remember this? We never gave it a second thought because it's not unusual for a new clutch and a rebuilt transmission to drag initially. But just a few hours before the show, we found out that that's not what that was. It turns out that with bare hubs, there was very little rolling resistance in the transmission, and that allowed the synchros to line up and sneak into gear. As we added rotating mass with the brakes and the wheels, it became apparent that the clutch wasn't dragging. It wasn't actually disengaging at all.
So, what was occurring? Well, actually, it's a fairly simple problem. The pedal ratio we've got does not allow enough travel at the master cylinder to fully disengage the clutch. In any other car, you'd just push it further. But in our case, some bell end put a bulkhead in the way. The obvious solution is just start the pedal further back here to give you more travel. And we can't do that because it gets too close to the seat and you can't get your foot on it. Meaning that to get more movement at our master cylinder within our allowable travel, our only option is to change the pedal ratio. So that's exactly what we did. Bollocks. You could call that suboptimal, but only because the master cylinders we're using do not allow this degree of misalignment without binding up. But that's not to say doing our alteration didn't get us what we wanted. Far from it. It just means we've moved on to a whole brand new shiny problem. Don't look at it like that. I was young. I needed the money.
And it was 4 in the morning the day of the show.
Works perfectly. As you saw, that did actually work. We ended up with enough travel at the master cylinder to actually fully disengage the clutch. Yay! What it also did was made the clutch pedal so damn heavy that the car was pretty much undrivable. Boo. Actually thinking about it, that's an entirely different problem, so I'm still calling this a win.
We'd been cognizant that if we matched the original Toyota setup with regard to cylinder size and pedal ratio, we should have absolutely no problem because to all intents and purposes, the setup was identical. We chose the 5/8 Tilton master cylinder to match the original one. A bigger one would disengage the clutch nicely, but would make the pedal even harder, so no bueno. We made the pedal to match the stock ratio of 7:1, so there's nothing we can do there either. We could fit a lighter clutch, but we expect ours to handle all of the safeties, and we don't want to compromise that. So there's no easy bolt-on solutions.
Which leaves us with 5 options. We can either chop up and extend the lower bulkhead, but to do that we'd have to relocate the steering rack. We could lengthen the steering column, remove the front seats and drive the car from the back. Or we could lower the driver's side floor a load so we can have a longer pedal. I'm not massively keen on any of those, to be honest with you, so you're going to have to leave this one with me a bit. I know it looks more elaborate than it needs to be, but actually the geometry in here is fairly simple and it was quite easy to arrive at. The tricky bit is getting that geometry to fit in the space available and then actually being able to assemble it. So if this setup works as well in the car as it does on the bench, we are golden. Not bad for a first attempt.
The box of shame. Well, not really. None of these is a failure. They're just another way that it wouldn't work. Because of the forces involved, all of these had to be fabbed like it was staying on the car. We couldn't just mock them up out of thin tin. And given that we couldn't change any of the bits that would have made a difference, then this is the only way we could have achieved a clutch pedal that disengages and is light enough to use. I mean, the squeak's going to drive him nuts, but the contraption is in. I suppose the only thing left to do now is to try it.
Sorted! The clutch fully disengages and it's light enough to use more than once a day. But just how light is it? Well, to find that out, we're going to have to turn to science.
In a bog standard French shopping trolley, the clutch pedal needs just 8 kilos of force to depress it. But that's hardly a fair comparison. So here's a Subaru Impreza WRX STI. This OEM clutch needs a much more significant 18 kilos. That's around 40 pounds. So what of the Mini? Well, with Nick's contrivance, we need just under 17 kilos to disengage the clutch. Excellent.
Well, I suppose it is all subjective, but we've only got Nick's word that it was ever really a problem in the first place. I just assumed he was being a massive wench.
I f***ing knew you'd get me shit over this. Don't move. Here. It's the clutch pedal equivalent of trying to lift Kate Beckinsale.
Or to put it in a slightly less stalkery way, that's like leg pressing a Tremec T56 Magnum with one leg every time you want to change gear.
So I'll concede it probably was worth spending all that time to get where we are now. So we've sorted our most pressing issue, but if you remember, that wasn't our only problem.
After working perfectly for weeks, the Flexi shaft broke just a couple of days before the show. After some detective work, we think what happened was that the inertia contained within the alternator, the belt, the tensioner, and the AC pump pulley was too much to allow the Flexi drive to decelerate at the same rate as the engine. This meant that the spiral drive shaft unwound a bit when the engine revs dropped. It grew as it did so and bulged into the reinforced outer, grabbed it and unwound the whole assembly off the threaded end. This resulted in some nasty noises from within the engine bay and a significant amount of swearing and gnashing of teeth. A brand new Flexi drive was going to be nearly £500 and a 3-month wait, so we thought we'd have a go at making one. This was not £500 and definitely isn't a second-hand Husqvarna brush cutter drive, but it looks identical to the expensive custom one, so we'll give it a stab. We racked our brains, researched like mad and tried various different ways of driving the alternator, but we kept coming back to the fact that this was the best if not the only feasible way. To make a decent job of this, we're going to have to cut this cable to length and crimp our own ends on. And to do that, we're going to need a tool, and not just the one using the TIG. So this is the moment of truth, really. For our homemade Flexi shaft to work as we need to, this crimp needs to be strong, secure and concentric. This is a step into the unknown, as we've not tried making one of these before. I mean, it looks alright, but only time will tell if it's been as successful as we hope. The Flexi shaft is going inside some PTFE tube removed from a piece of -6 stainless fuel line. We figure that the self-lubricating properties of the PTFE will be an advantage. The tube is slid on, and then the Flexi drive part of the new system is finished by crimping the other end on. Lovely. For the outer part of the drive shaft, we're using more hose bits. This time, some -10, which is 4 bigger. We need to get rid of the female swivel end and cut an M18 by 1.5 male thread onto the remaining spigot. We bought a cheap Imperial and metric tap and die set a while back for those just-in-case occasions. This happens to be one of the many that have cropped up. The corresponding female thread is then cut into the original Flexi shaft drive ends. This thread was M15 by 1.25. That's a stupid size, so we needed to go bigger. Inside the big -10 reinforced rubber hose, we're wrestling a length of -8 PTFE lined stainless steel braided hose. Trial and error led us to realise that the hoses, with some persuasion, would go inside each other. And once we realised that, we figured we could adapt the fittings to make our own skookum outer cable. Then through the whole lot, the Flexi shaft is slid through. The -6 PTFE tube fits perfectly inside the -8 PTFE lined hose. The final part of the assembly is to screw on the drive ends. These are the only part of the original expensive cable we've retained. So there you have it. One reimagined Flexi drive cable made ostensibly from bits we already had in the shed.
So what's to stop the same thing happening again, I hear you ask? Well, it's simple. Where the old shaft went into the alternator pulley with a keyway, that's been machined out and made bigger, and we've press fit a one-way needle roller bearing. When the shaft is turning the alternator pulley in the direction of the engine, it locks up so it drives the alternator. If there's any overrun at all from the alternator, it just freewheels over the roller bearings and we can't get any backlash. Even though this car's been put together with a heady mix of sheer bloody-mindedness, luck and hot beverages, there were always going to be some teething troubles. And honestly, I think we're probably better off getting them out of the way now, instead of having the disappointment of finally getting the thing on the road and then breaking it. Still, it's fixed for now. And yes, that is an awful lot of work to put us back to where we were before we went to the show, but in reality, I think we're only probably 18 months behind where we wanted to be 3 years ago.
Tune in next time for another exciting episode from the files of Project Binky.